Hello, welcome to the Adtech Marketing Podcast, the only podcast exclusively devoted to Adtech marketing. My name is Joe Zappa. I'm the CEO and founder of Sharp Media, which is an Adtech marketing agency. But I'm not going to rant at you necessarily about Adtech marketing in this pod. I want to talk a bit about what's going on in marketing and media and why I would do another podcast. Because if you're listening to this, if you have the potential misfortune of working in this very niche world of Adtech marketing, you may know that I have another podcast with Eric Franchi called Open Market. Okay, so why do another one? I mean, that one, for one, is focused on entrepreneurship, go-to-market, investing, trends in ad tech, a whole bunch of different things, whereas this is going to be even more niche than that niche podcast and focusing specifically on the topics of ad tech marketing. But there's another reason I wanted to do a second pod, which is to have really free-flowing conversations just about what I'm seeing in media and culture, to have something that's really distinctly me, which means if you are going to listen to this, maybe you give a shit about that. I don't know. We're going to find out, maybe starting right now. So part of the reason I think it's worth doing a second podcast is because I think media and marketing are heading toward this sort of barbell situation where on the one hand, you have text media, and on the other hand, you have audio. And text, I think, is going to become even more compressed. What do I mean by that? It's not necessarily like Twitter in 2009 per se. It's not necessarily about being super pithy above everything or there being really strict text length constraints on a given platform. Obviously, even on Twitter or X, people now post really long AI-generated things. But my hunch and my increasing impression of late is that on those text-driven platforms like X and LinkedIn, people are getting so wise to the proliferation of AI-generated content that they are going to start discounting it. And the volume of content on those platforms is going to grow, but the consumption is going to decrease. Or even if the overall consumption doesn't decrease, which I think remains to be seen, the trust is going to decrease. And so I think we've seen this interesting phenomenon in media where you have a precipitous decline over the last 10 to 20 years in faith in what is sometimes called the mainstream media, whether that's like a CNN or a New York Times. And there's a growth in trust and in usage of what became known as social media. I think AI is going to introduce this new paradigm where there's like a huge crisis of trust in social media. And if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, well, but there's already a crisis of trust in social media. I mean, my response to that would be like, sort of. I think among a certain group of like educated people, often more liberal people who are still invested in like objective reporting of the style that the New York Times does, there has long been, especially dating back to 2016 and Facebook's alleged role in Trump's election, there's long been among that cohort of educated people a skepticism about social media. But broadly speaking, I think for the average consumer, there's actually a lot of faith in those user-generated content-driven platforms that is now going to decline due to AI-generated content. Even if you go behind the sort of the seriousness of politics and the overall level of trust, even just think about it as a business person. And again, to get back to this sort of world of ad tech marketing, LinkedIn is becoming a hellscape of AI-generated pablum. It's very clear that even smart people that I really trust and respect, it's not that they're using AI for the posts, because that's not necessarily problematic. It's that Publicis is buying LiveRamp, and these executives are just going to LinkedIn and they're just like, give me a take on Publicis buying LiveRamp. And then they're just copy and pasting it and posting it on LinkedIn. So the barrier to content creation and to expressing an opinion has been democratized to such an extent that I think these platforms are becoming corrupted and people just are not going to want to use them and probably will continue to use them, but are just going to put less and less faith in them. Okay, so that goes back to the barbell point I was attempting to articulate, that I think on the one hand, you're going to have these text platforms that are going to be dominated by AI slop, and people are going to react to that by being really human and really short form. So this is what I've been doing recently is like on Twitter and LinkedIn. I used to write longer stuff on both of those platforms and especially on LinkedIn by hand. But there's so much AI slop now that when I read those platforms, I'm like, unless I can clearly tell that something is human, I don't even want to read a longer post. And even if it is human, I'm just like, there's so much text to get through. There's so much slop and BS that I don't want to spend the time doing that. So what I increasingly value on these text-driven platforms, and I'm starting to create myself, is shorter, pithier content. So there's this funny situation, this sort of reversal where even as like X, for example, allows much longer posts and people use AI to generate those posts, I actually think we're going to see a resurgence of the kind of content that dominated X in the earlier days by necessity, given the constraints of the platform, which would be like really short, human, pithy, maybe unhinged posts. So then if on one side of the barbell, you have these short, human, pithy, funny posts on like an X or a LinkedIn on the text-driven platforms, what else do you get? And I think that is going to be the domain of what I'm trying to do here, which is like really expressive, particular, personality-driven, long-form content. And I think audio and video to a lesser degree will be the natural forums for that kind of content. And so this is, I think, the purpose of launching a second podcast at this time when you might be thinking, oh my God, people have so much content to get through. How can they possibly make the time for this? I think if anyone out there wants to market themselves and wants to have sort of a public intellectual footprint, you're going to basically have two avenues. One is really short and human, pithy bursts, often of humor on the text platforms. And then the other is like long form, messy, full of divergences. And that is what I'm trying to do here. So yeah, we're going to talk about ad tech marketing, and like what I've just been talking about is essentially a fundamental question in media and marketing. But we're also going to touch on a bunch of other subjects as well, right? Like that sort of crazy rant I just went on about the state of media today driven by AI, but also in the context of the last 10 to 20 years. It's a kind of rumination that is hard to do on the text-driven platforms where like, you're just not going to give me the time to do that. You're going to move on. And I get it because I do the exact same thing. But it's also hard to do on podcasts unless they are sort of specifically devoted to that enterprise. And so that's what I want this to be, is like, I want it to be about best practices and philosophies in ad tech marketing. And again, in the sense I've already been doing that on this pod, but I also want this to be really free flowing. I want this to be, sometimes it's 7 minutes and sometimes it might be 2 hours, right? And sometimes it might be a solo pod and sometimes it might be me and a public company ad tech CMO or CEO who has particular thoughts about marketing or is an excellent practitioner. Or sometimes it might be another member of my team whom you guys will all get to know. But that's what I want this to be, is about ad tech marketing, best practices and philosophies. But I also want it to feel deeply me, deeply unstructured, because I think that is the direction that ad tech marketing and media and all marketing and media are heading. With that said, I hope I've got your attention, and I'm going to have some dope podcasts coming your way soon. Thanks, guys.